Take out from your bulletins the insert that'll help you to follow along this morning as we continue looking at our lessons from legends. Some of the Old Testament individuals that perhaps we have remembered from our Sunday school days, perhaps in some other way we have come across them, and try and bring out some truths from their lives for us. This morning our focus is going to be on what about chance? What about chance? I'm somewhat certain that you've probably had the opportunity, as I have, to talk with someone or individuals who really don't believe in a higher power, whether they call it or him God or something else. They don't believe in an individual or something that is kind of guiding and directing our world, all of creation. Talked with individuals who probably have more of a leaning to looking at so many different things and determining that's just coincidence, that's just chance, that simply happens. And they don't want to accept a higher power. They don't want to accept God guiding and directing. If you're anything at all like me, we feel sorry for you, but other than that, we also realize that it can become very frustrating talking with somebody who really settles on that idea that life is just circumstances of happen chance, and there is nothing that kind of guides and directs life. It's frustrating for me because it goes completely against my beliefs. It's frustrating for me because it is completely contrary to what the Word of God tells us as far as how our lives are ordered by God, how our world, our creation is overseen by God. So hopefully this morning, as we finish up looking at the legend this morning that we will see, hopefully we'll have a better understanding in regards to answering an individual who believes everything is just kind of chance or just happens. We're going to look at a female legend from the Old Testament this morning when we consider what about chance. Most of us will be familiar with her name. Her name is Esther. And I would encourage you to follow along as I read from Esther chapter 4. Esther chapter 4, beginning with that first verse. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to her, to attend to her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law: that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone and of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night, or night or day. And I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Historically, what we see happening here is that Mordecai was a low official within King Xerxes' court, his government. And there was an individual called Haman who was a stronger and bigger official, who he desired that every lower official would bow down, would give him the respect, the honor. Mordecai, whether it was out of his relationship to God, whether it was some other reason, but for whatever reason, he refused to acknowledge Haman. He would not bow. And because of that, Haman looked for this opportunity to be able to not only do away with Mordecai, but to do away with all of Mordecai's race, the nation of Israel, the Jewish people. Esther was Mordecai's niece. Mordecai had raised Esther after Esther's parents had died. Esther, as best we can see, was a very beautiful girl. She seemed to be an individual that liked to please people, because even after she was living in the king's palace, she sought to do what her uncle Mordecai asked her to do. She had a countenance about her that made her appealing. We'll see in a few moments how it all came about that she became queen. But before that, let's look at something that's important as far as the history to understand why Mordecai believes that if it wasn't Esther who would be the one responsible for saving the Jewish people, that there would be someone else. Now, interestingly enough, in the book of Esther, we find that there is no mention of the name God. In fact, in the book of Esther, we find that there's no mention of prayer. We find fasting, which usually with the Israelite people would be joined together with prayer. So we can make that assumption. But there's no actual word for God in the book of Esther, and yet God is throughout the pages of Esther. And so we need to look first off this morning, looking at the covenant God. The fact that God is a God who keeps covenants is so important to the fact that the Jewish people would not be annihilated by Haman or by anyone else. The Israelites, the Jews, are God's special chosen people. And He will not allow their extinction to take place. God established between Himself and the nation of Israel a covenant. And when God makes a covenant, He will be true to it. He will not allow anything to be broken with that. I think there's probably two covenants that Mordecai was remembering in that full assurance that the Jews would not be annihilated. I think the first one is in Genesis chapter 12, where we go back, and this is the beginning covenant, the father of the nation of Israel, the Abrahamic covenant. We find recorded for us there, the Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." The promise of a great nation to Abraham, the nation of Israel. The Israelites, the Jewish people. God's blessing upon them. This would be more than enough to believe that the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, would never be wiped out completely from the face of this earth. But God even reinforced that with the Davidic covenant, with David. God said, "The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from you before, or whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." Nathan reported to David all the words of this entire revelation. God's further promise to not only the Jewish people, but specifically to the line of David, that his kingdom, his throne, would be established forever. Now, the Hebrew term for covenant has a wide variety of applications. If we were to talk about a covenant between two businessmen, we'd be talking about a contract. If we were talking about a covenant within a country, we'd be talking about a constitution. If we were talking about a covenant between two nations, we'd be talking about a treaty. Here is perhaps the best single definition of a covenant. It is a legally binding formal expression of intent. A legally binding formal expression of intent. God's intent was that the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, would be his, would be blessed. And anyone that curses them would be cursed. And that David's throne would be forever. We know that's the truth because he sent his one and only Son, Jesus Christ, through the line of David. And Jesus will reign forever one day. Now, in Abraham's time, there were also several different types of covenant. There was a covenant that could be formed by eating together. It was the covenant of breads or salt. If you wanted to make an agreement, you would sit down with the meal. If you shared the bread, that was the covenant of the bread. If you some ritual with the salt, it would be a covenant of the salt. The most binding of all covenants was the covenant of blood, and that was where the two parties involved in the covenant would walk between the two halves of a sacrificed animal. It was this covenant that God made with Abraham. Listen, when God makes a promise, he'll never go back on his word. Each covenant that God has made within his word tells us exactly what God's intentions are and what He plans to do. And what God plans to do, He will certainly do. I mean, we have the covenants of the Old Testament, but then we also see the picture of what we call the New Covenant. Jeremiah had a picture of this new covenant. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. You see, in the new covenant, what God promises is an inner transformation. The old covenants, they had to do with our behavior, how we acted. It was external. But God now says there is now going to be that new covenant that will come about where I'll have a personal relationship with each one who is in relationship with me. I will transform their lives. I will transform their hearts. Their sins will be forgiven. I will know them in a personal way, and they will know me in a personal way. Jeremiah wrote about this looking forward to the promised Messiah who was yet to come. Come, as we know, first for Israel, but then opened up to all people. As Jeremiah says, it will be for all people. Anyone who recognizes God as their Redeemer. That relationship, that transformation will take place. The new covenant there, Jesus Himself talked about. He said, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." The covenant God, promising not only to Israel that they would be a people who would be His people, who would be blessed by those who bless them, and who would be receive curse for anyone who curses them. And then God extends that covenant to you and I. An acceptance of Christ's sacrifice for us. That we would be transformed, that our lives would be free of sin because I don't think when we consider that God is a covenant God, that there's any opportunity that chance no longer has a place within our vocabulary. There's no such thing as chance or coincidence. Rather, we have that Christian doctrine which we call providence. It's not in Scripture, that word, but certainly it is there. Demonstrating that God is in full control of every detail of every life in all of creation. Look, if we consider Esther, how anyone could read Esther from start to finish and ever believe that all this was simply chance is beyond ridiculous. Esther is one of those books that it's not a long book, but it is a book that contains the story of Esther and how God uses Mordecai and Esther in bringing the redemption of Israel from possible extinction, that really needs to be read from start to finish in one sitting. So you see the whole story, you see how it all goes together. And again, it's not that long, so it doesn't take a great deal of time to do it. But anyone that could ever read Esther and say, you know what, this is all just chance. I couldn't wrap my head around that individual who could say that. I mean, let's look at what takes place within the book of Esther. Mordecai. He's a minor court official who adopts his beautiful niece when her parents died. Because he was a minor court official, Mordecai was in the perfect position to be able to present Esther as a possible candidate to be the new queen. Okay. Maybe chance. Vashti, who happened to be the original queen, refused to appear before King Xerxes. He had commanded that she present herself to him. And she did what really you should never do to a king. She said no. And because of that, she was no longer queen. Chance. Haggai, the eunuch in charge of Xerxes' harem, took a liking to Esther and helped her win the king's approval. Something about her was just radiant that allowed this official to give her special attention. Give her the place of prominence where she would be more in the king's path. Chance, Mordecai uncovered a plot that was against Xerxes to be able to kill him. And Mordecai was able to explain to Esther, who was able to explain to the king what was going to take place. So the king was not executed. And a small little detail that doesn't seem like a great thing, seems like something was overlooked. Mordecai wasn't rewarded for having brought that to save the king's life. Well, Haman, who did not like Mordecai, and because he did not like Mordecai, decided that he did not like any of the people who were like Mordecai. Any of the Jewish people, decided that he wanted to be able to kill all the Jews. For whatever reason, the king just quickly agreed to this. Mordecai wasn't sure when this should happen. And so he asked the diviners of the land to cast lots and find out the day when the people should rise up against the Jews and kill them all. A lot just happened to fall on a date that was 12 months later, giving Esther and Mordecai more than enough time to be able to deal with the plot and the counter plot against it. Mordecai just urged Esther to act, who just again happened to be queen. Realizing, as Mordecai's words would say, that she might have become queen for just a reason such as this. The night before Xerxes and Haman were to come to a banquet that Esther had invited them to, it just so happened that the king was unable to sleep, and so rather than pick up a book or something read to him that was of great interest that would cause him to pay real attention, he asked for something that I would think would probably put him to sleep. A record of what has happened during his reign till this point. His own history is what he wanted read, and wouldn't it just so happen that the individual that was going to read this to the king happened to open to the period of time where Mordecai had discovered the plot to assassinate the king. And it just happened that in that record of Xerxes' reign, that it was recorded not only that Mordecai determined that there had been an oversight, and at that Xerxes was probably a little tired, having not slept the night before, but even honor Mordecai for having disrupted the plot to take his life years earlier, immediately ordered that Haman be hung on the exact gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai. In all these things, especially the timing of the events, How one circumstance just naturally led into the next one. How each turning point channeled history to the next step, leading ultimately to that place where the Jewish people were saved. Sure, if you wanted to, you could take one or two of those things. Say by chance, just happened. But when you honestly look at each step, there is no room for chance. Although God is not mentioned in the book, as I said before, His fingerprints are in each and every step. What does Esther mean to us? What do we take away from the book of Esther? What is a lesson we can learn from this legend? I think the first lesson that perhaps comes to us so clearly is the fact that we learn that God is always at work in the lives of His people. Those things that others would say are coincidences or chances, they mark our lives as God's fingerprints upon us. That He is at work. That you and I and our events of our lives are not simply products of cause and effect or random chance, but obviously what is taking place is that God is guiding and directing everything to work out for our good, even as Paul would record to the Romans. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. God's in control. God is watching out for you, and He's watching out for me. All we need to do is continue to remain in the right perspective to see that He desires what is best for us. And even in the book of Esther, we can see there that in the midst of what looked like a tragedy, what looked like disaster to come upon the people of God, the Jewish people, that was not the case. God took what was intended for evil and moved it to great victory for the nation of Israel, for the Jewish people. I think our key verse there is that 14th verse. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. Mordecai almost seems a little harsh as he deals with Esther here to simply say, listen, you can't say no to this. This is what you need to do. The Jews are going to be delivered. Listen, look there. There is solid faith by Mordecai. He has no doubt within his own mind and his own ability that what is going to take place is that the Jews will be saved. They will be granted freedom. And he says to Esther, if it's not you, it'll be someone else. That full assurance, that confidence that God will accomplish His will, that He will be true to the covenants that He has made with the Jewish people. And that God will be true to His word. And whether, Esther, you do it or not, somebody will. But to give Esther some encouragement, some strength, some guidance, he says, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. You know, we don't know where we'll find ourselves tomorrow, the next week, the week after that, months, years, whatever. But what we can be certain of when we look at the book of Esther is the fact that wherever we find ourselves, if we're being obedient to God, if we find ourselves being obedient to His will, no matter what our weaknesses may be, no matter what struggles we may have, we can be certain that God is with us. And indeed, God maybe has placed us right where we are in order to not only serve Him, but to serve the benefit and the good of others. And when God calls us to step up and to step out for Him, to do His work, to be His voice, to be His hands, He'll give us everything we need to go beyond what we could naturally do. Commentators believe that Esther, she wasn't a forceful individual. Commentators believe that she really wasn't assertive, didn't take initiative. And so really what God was asking her to do through Mordecai, as he said, this is your time to step up. This is why you're here as queen. To be able to make a difference for your people. Esther had to step out of what was probably her comfort zone. What was within her character. She wasn't the one to take initiative. When Mordecai first approached her and said, you've got to go and talk to the king, Esther said, I can't do that. You know the law. If I approach the king, he can kill me because I haven't been summoned by him. But I think she received inner strength from the encouragement and strength from Mordecai to be able to a second time go and say, okay, I'll approach the king, and if I perish, I perish. I will know that I have done what was right and what I should do. And as she did so, God met her in a special way, and the king extended the gold scepter and let her enter into his presence. Present the offering of the meal for him and Haman to come to, and thus bring about the change that was scheduled by, but give them rather a great victory. Because Esther was with opportunity, and to use it as only God could allow her to use it for. What about chance? I think Esther lets us know very clearly, no such thing. That's all the providential work of God in each and every one of our lives. Let's pray.